Hello, listeners, and welcome to the latest episode of the AdQuick Madvertising Podcast, a podcast that explores the intersection of content, creativity, advertising, all of the things that you care about. Today, we have a special guest. We have Mitch Joel. He's one of the OG bloggers and marketers in the ad space. He is an agency founder, which I think he sold to WPP a while ago. And he's got a whole new company that we're going to talk a little bit about today. Mitch really doesn't need an intro. You've read his thoughts on marketing. You read his books. He's really one of the people that's helped me form the basis of how I think about our industry and our craft. So we're very lucky to have him on the show today. Mitch, welcome to the show.
Adam, it's a pleasure. It's been a beat. We, in the past, have had lots of great connections. I know when I was down at Google, we had a good hang in person several years ago, and I love the name of the show. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and then our founder of our company is very big into Mad Men. So we sat down for a brainstorm and deciding the show name, and we came up with this. So thank you for calling that out.
I love it.
So Mitch, I have a bunch of questions that I thought of, and I also thought it was fun. Since you're really into AI, I asked the AI for a few questions. So we're going to have a mix of both, and we'll just have a fun conversation.
Yeah, we'll see who's better. It might be AI who has better questions. We're going to figure this out, Adam. Let's see how impressive you are against the machine.
Well, I know you very well, so I didn't ask the AI to go into LinkedIn. I said, here's everything I know about Mitch, and put in some of your company info. So let's start with a really simple one, because I think this is really interesting for what you're doing right now. When you say you help leaders decode the future, I love that. What does that practically mean in a world when I feel like everyone thinks they're a futurist and there's so many of these people, but you're legitimately someone who's done a great job with trends. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you think about this and what this even means?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like the word futurist. I've jokingly referred to myself as a presentist. So when I think about the world today, what I'm typically thinking about is what are the things that are cultural norms in terms of how digital technology has impacted us by both a behavior standpoint and how we actually buy? And what is it that brands are not connecting in terms of that? What might be the opportunities that they don't see in that? So that would be the whole futures aspect of it. And Decode the Future would be a big shout out to my dear friend Clay Hebert, who has this theory that you need to somehow differentiate yourself as a thought leader. And he actually came up with this. I was actually speaking at an event and he was speaking prior to me. And I guess one of the things he does live is he'll demonstrate what he means by how to introduce yourself and how to position yourself by using people in the room. And so I walked in and my face was on the screen and it said, Mitch helps leaders decode the future. And I thought, that's actually really good. But his point, which is actually really salient and relevant to marketers, is when you have a line like that, it's can you actually take and conjugate it? So if you think about this idea of decode the future, which sounds a bit different than everyone else, I can say things like, I write about decoding the future. I speak about decoding the future. I consult about. So it became this thing where I thought it was just a very good tagline for explaining what I do, which really is just working at the intersection of what are brands needing to do to move forward? What is this consumer behavior we're seeing? How is technology impacting that? And then can you mix and match those three things? And thankfully, it's been a almost 3-decade plus career of doing that. And my joke, which I'm sure you can appreciate, is that when you talk about the future, it's a very wide and long highway. There's a lot of opportunities and a lot of changes. And I think AI is a great example of a massive disruption to what we're seeing in business today, that while I was talking about it 10, 15 years ago, it really only became some type of commercialization in the past 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I think AI is such an interesting trend because it really does build upon the past of what marketers and creatives have already done in their work, whether it was, creating videos, infographics, talks. All of this work that we've done is what has trained the AI. So in a lot of ways, as a marketer, if you've done a really good job with your brand over the last few years, you've kind of prepared yourself very well for the current state of the world. Because AI tools are already crawling you. You already have a large footprint and presence. I think for startups in particular, it's super valuable versus, large companies are obviously already trained on AIs and already, part of that machine since they're so ubiquitous in the culture. But I think like digital marketers who did a really good job, like a lot of them probably don't even get credit for all of the, all of the leads and awareness that AI is generating for them now. There's like this whole new class of GEOs and AI consultants that are kind of selling all these new tools. But when I use AI, I kind of see that a lot of, at least what comes to me from a brand, it's clearly work that's been done over the past 10 years for companies. So it's a really interesting time. I'm curious, how do you see the AI trend as different than, say, the other waves of search, social, mobile, because it is different. But there are things that are the same, like, okay, you have to learn this, but there are some things that are radically different. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
It's a massive, complex question. The meta question is, if we are at the precipice of something even related to an artificial general intelligence or an artificial superintelligence, what does that mean to a marketer today? That's a really big question, because I believe that what I'm currently seeing at the level of output that you can get is that it's already challenging, forget knowledge workers, but in particular marketers. And I think it does that because the system by which we've developed the trade of marketing, unfortunately or fortunately, falls squarely in the arena of what AI likes to eat for breakfast. So what I mean by that is, typically people like you and I were left in offices and we would be trotted out for the clients that are willing to pay for access to people who have a deep bench of knowledge. In the mid 2000s, that shifted a little bit because people like you and I, and how we met was through the social channels. So suddenly we are writing about it. We are talking about it. We are creating videos about it. And there's this body of work mostly available free at a global scale in multiple languages from multiple thought leaders of people who are typically in that corner, that were the core, that key person in the agreement, that strategist, that thinker, that person who knew how to do this stuff. And why I say it's great that happened, because we all learned and grew together. And that was a fascinating, it still continues to be a fascinating time for marketing. The challenge is that what it was a bit of rinse and repeat, meaning that as people like you and I accrued information, experience, and knowledge, it was quite repeatable. Meaning we could take that big client and transfer that to the next big client. The nuance would be the business that the client is in, but essentially they're coming to you for that work. Whether you were a search engine optimization expert, whether you're a digital media buyer planner, it didn't really matter. That was the specialty. I think AI likes to eat that idea for breakfast. And so the opportunity with this is to figure out, what is that nuance? What can I bring, if I'm still part of those types of verticals within marketing, that makes each experience better, different, or unique? Because otherwise we're just working on that historical information. And that's what AI does. It's pulling historical information and giving it some type of new spin that isn't generic to everybody who's accessing that particular query or question. That's what fundamentally it's doing. And so in that, we have a lot of challenges from the strategic side. On the production side, we have even bigger challenges. The fact that we can use text prompts to create images, videos, the fact that we have a lot of generative AI engines in a lot of the editing tools, and the things that were the métier, the skill and the craft of the production side of marketing is now very much at risk, even in generating some type of music. Now we can say, well, it's not great. I'd argue it's pretty great. I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of the videos created by fans for Star Wars as an example. Like, it's not animation and it's not exactly what you would see in the cinema, but we're getting really, really close. And I do think for many instances of things we would be producing from a marketing materials perspective, whether it's advertising or communications, there's a lot of outputs that I find exceptionally impressive. And even if I don't, I could argue that you could create content within the genre of that nobody would be able to point to and go, well, that's AI because there's 6 fingers on a hand and type. Like, I'm well beyond that. And so this creates a new palette where I call this vibe content, where does it matter how the sausages are made in the sausage factory, or is it really ultimately about how it tastes? And so if you have a skill in terms of building the prompt, having the database, having the information in there to push it forward, suddenly it gets very, very dynamic and different. So on one hand, you have this whole new arena of creativity and tools and this beautiful palette. On the other hand, we have to figure out what it means if all of our historical information is now in the engine and doesn't necessarily require us to extract it. So there's a lot of dynamics here at play. The last thing I'll say is I do believe some of the strategies we used before are no longer effective. So quick example would be if you think about SEO. As you mentioned, I've been publishing for close to 20 years, in some instances over 20 years, very, very publicly. Now, if I brought it to an SEO optimized agency and said, what should I do with this platform that I have, this blog, this podcast? They'd say archive almost all of it. Like Google won't index it all. Choose the ones that have the most traffic and the most links and do all that stuff. That's fantastic. And it's true, although it would bury most of the 20 years of my content. When you shift this over to generative AI, I can tell you last year, over a handful of keynote speaking events that I got were because they found me through generative AI. And when I brought that back to these SEO experts, the answer was, oh, yeah, it's a bit of a different story now. What does it favor? Well, that engine actually favors authentic voice, consistency, a body of work. And so there's a conflict that you see right there in terms of what was this homogenous type of SEO writing. Now in a world where if things do shift and continue to shift in the direction of generative AI and suggested results, what we're seeing is the more human voice wins, which is somewhat ironic if you think about it. The more human voice wins in the more AI generated space.
That's probably one of the more optimistic comments I've heard for, just creators and authors and authors in general, that there was so much SEO spam before, people with all these tricks, and maybe the AI is smart enough to surface, high quality thinkers like content, yourself, or, real authors, and not the people who are just the best at the growth hacks of the day. Right. So I hope that's true too.
If you push it forward, it's even more interesting, because what happened is you would make the argument that a lot of the content read as human, but we knew we were optimizing it for the engine, which means that all of that content is now a part of what the artificial intelligent prompts are looking at, which is why when people then say to us, oh, well, the results aren't that great. I'm like, how could they be great? Everybody created content to the mean, to the middle, to make it accessible from Google, Yahoo, whatever it is you were doing. So why this wins in that instance is because I wasn't playing to the mean. I was writing in a human voice, and there was a large volume of it. And so that's where it gets even more interesting, which is why when I'm using these tools and someone will say to me, hey, do you find that, Claude isn't as good as it was, or ChatGPT, this version is not as great? I'm like, I don't have that issue at all. And the reason I don't is because it's mostly parsing from my own content that's already public and available and there. So all of that stuff is just interesting fodder to how to think about brand and storytelling in this day and age where, again, we were kind of brought up in the digital channel on focus purely on the performance. Don't worry so much about it. The algorithm is so static that's the formula it needs to build a better algorithm. And now what we're seeing as this shift is happening is maybe it wasn't.
Yeah, it was. You also said something really interesting was the fact that there was a period in time, people like you and me were paid money to go into companies and teach them and help them use digital tools. And like you said, sort of say the same things over and over again. And honestly, while it was paid sometimes good money for that work, I didn't like it. I like the creative aspects of marketing. I didn't like doing the same hand-holding of executives and of, brand teams and whatnot, to use tools that you and I, use daily and didn't have a problem with, and update processes to, be more data driven or, just be more efficient. And so I actually like the notion of AI answering everyone's basic questions about everything. So we don't have to do that, because it gets us to more interesting places and interesting work. And I had always hoped there'd come a day that everyone was super up to speed on how all these tech tools worked. And so all the conversations could be at a high level and we could be doing things creatively. And I think AI is actually the thing that gets us here, because pre-AI, we were all still getting kind of the same questions that I always felt were things you should have known a decade ago, right? So that's the thing that makes me most excited about AI. It's like, yes, remove all of this busy work and these duplicate questions and get people up to sort of the same place.
Well, I have bad news for you, Adam. I don't know if you're familiar with this new term, work slop, but that's where we're at right now. So it turns out it's not actually accurate, that what we're seeing with a lot of this technology is that it's generating a lot of work slop. This idea that we're using these tools, it's going to record the meeting, it's going to transcribe the meeting, it's going to give us action items. Those action items are going to be copy and pasted. Someone's going to email them to someone else. That person's going to take that email, put into their AI so they respond to fact. Like, we are at the beginning of what is probably some type of tsunami / avalanche of a little bit more of that. The nuance that I would give to that is, just because we had a level of expertise in a domain that was required, I don't feel like it was often repetitive. In fact, what I really loved, maybe it's the antithesis of what you're saying, which is fine. We both have very different lived experiences, was the fact that I really loved understanding all of these different businesses, B2B, B2C, retail, tech, finance, telcos, pharma. I was learning so much about not just the company, but the industry, regulations, highly regulated, non-regulated, what their challenges were, what their competition looked like. For me, it was almost a complete opposite feeling. I felt like every day I was exploring some new garden. And there were so many opportunities in it. In fact, when I think about my frustration in the time that I was running the digital agency, I'm talking about like 2000 till about 10 plus years ago, it was more in the fact that I wished everybody would have been more adept at switching over to the channel. Why? Because it was really, really clear in the instance where we were that everything we were doing was fundamentally moving a needle. I mean, if I think in particular about email marketing, and I think about how traditional some of these brands were in terms of physical mail and reaching out, and just the land grab of acquiring email addresses and communicating in that way and watching that convert into new accounts being opened, new sales being created. We were dealing with massive retailers at the time who couldn't even imagine competing with a company like Walmart. They would talk in terms of like, wouldn't it be great if we could do $1 million in sales, big, massive national brands. And so to me, it was more about that exploration that I loved. So yes, having access to our level of intelligence and what we knew about it was somewhat limited, and that's what created somewhat of a premium. But being able to deploy that onto all of these different businesses and challenges, to me, was so great. And that's why my level of excitement today is similar, because I see it much in the same way. And I'm watching it be deployed that way. It's like, how do we take this AI and replace customer service? And what you're actually seeing is when you start doing that, you're not just replacing or changing customer service. You're actually creating now a place where individuals can, quote unquote, chat, talk to the actual brand. Give me recommendations. If I was thinking about that, how does it compare to this? Questions we could never ask. Now, what that does is, again, going back to the SEO, AEO world that we were just talking about, suddenly you're now even building the questions through the frequency and seeing it, but able to use the output of the generative AI as new forms of content, which also go into the database. So like, it gets kind of like matrixy, bake your noodle when you start understanding the layers and opportunities in this. So it's, to me, it's super exciting times.
Yeah, I think one difference between us is you were running a shop and I was sitting at an agency. And the part you said about getting a viewpoint of a lot of different sectors is true and interesting, but I was watching all of my friends work at software companies and get equity and get rich. And so that persuaded me to join the tech side versus the consultant side. Yeah. But you're right. It is fun to get to go in and be the cowboy and, help them with the new frontier. I guess for me, I would have had to start an agency to have continued to find that fun. versus, seeing another one of my friends at a company that IPOs. Because the problem with we
were geographically challenged, meaning you were in the place where everybody was doing that. So I feel that for sure. Yeah.
It's hard. It's an interesting point too. When I was living in Florida and Minneapolis, I did not have that FOMO. And as soon as I was in Bay Area, I think the consultancy that recruited me out there, I think I lasted 18 months before I decided to join Google. It's just really hard,
Yeah.
Like a guy in my building was early employee at Instagram, and he was, like right when they got bought by Facebook, and I'm watching this and I'm like, oh, just falling behind.
It's also interesting too when I think back to my career and how many moments I felt that. And that's what's also really crazy. I mean, I was working in a search engine business before Google really even existed. I mean, in terms of before they were commercials. Like one of the stories Larry and Sarah tell is that they would be on the phone speaking to their competitors about like the tech stack. I was on one of those calls on the other end. And we were deploying all of these new ad models, from sponsorship to pay-per-click to listing by how much the client was paying. And all of this was somewhat heresy. I mean, even the guys at Google on the phone at the time were saying things like, oh, we wouldn't want to poison the well with that type of advertising. We were trying that. And so when you talk about that feeling of missing it, I couldn't even begin to tell you how many interesting domains and verticals I was purchasing and thinking about at the time. In fact, I started the podcast probably somewhere around 2003 or 4. I'd have to look, maybe in 2006. And I remember when I started the podcast, I felt, oh, like I'm late to the game. There's already all these podcasts about media and technology and marketing. And of course, you fast forward 20 years. And even at this moment, I'd say as sophisticated and mature as that market is, it's still probably nowhere near what it can be. So that's a feeling that I think anybody in this space feels. You always think about the things you didn't do that you could have done versus the things that seem obvious to you that now, I mean, think about the crypto. Crypto is a great story because at the time, what was happening is if you wanted to buy a computer, it was very hard to get a graphics card because all the crypto guys were taking these Nvidia graphics cards and using them for crypto. Now imagine you had invested in Nvidia back then. It sounds insane. Like there's no cards. They're overwhelmed. It's being used only for crypto. Who would have thought that was actually the technology basis in terms of the chips for AI? I mean, just imagine a slight investment in Nvidia during the crypto boom, what that would mean. It seemed insane then. Like people are like, oh, it's already overvalued. Well, take a look now.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when I recall in the 90s, I was big into building computers, and I built a gaming rig with, a 3DFX chip. They were bought by Nvidia. And what was interesting is none of the adults around me, when I had conversations with them, cared, right? Like I was telling them when I was a young person, hey, this is really interesting. These people are connecting online to play games and connect and communicate. And they're like, oh, that's just a toy. That doesn't matter. I was basically, kind of put off. And I imagine Mark Zuckerberg was encouraged. He was around people in Boston who were like, oh, here's how you can think about this. Here's how, this future might play out. And I think for young people today, I try and encourage them to be optimistic. I try and encourage them to tinker. I actually take a different approach with brand people. I say you have to be thoughtful about things. So you're not, like marketers were just rewarded for being early for so long that they kind of went along with the metaverse without asking too many questions. And for me, that one was always going to be a 0. Like you could try things, but don't let it be an embarrassment for your company. But I think, for young people broadly, they should dive into crypto, to AI, because there's like zero downside to just play around and learn things. And I know this because I played computer games and built a Quake form. I built like an early, BBS form, and that knowledge of how to create an online community was like super valuable for me when I became older. So you never know.
Yeah, even when you see interviews with Jensen from Nvidia and he's talking about the early days, he doesn't glaze over it. It's just interesting that the main usage of it was primarily video games and the sophistication. What I find interesting about it is whether or not those chips and those graphics cards were being used by, let's say the movie industry is a great example. It wasn't like he suddenly shifted focus to get chips that could be used for the development of CGI and all that. It's a very interesting business when you think about the fact that you're right. There was also a lack of sophistication and really understanding what was happening in the video game business. I remember when we started the agency, so it was probably in the early 2000s, like let's call it 2003, 2004. At that point, I remember writing about video games being such a great advertising and marketing opportunity, like getting your brand, if it is the right fit, into an NHL game or an NBA game or an NFL game on. And at the time, it was this unknown frontier. Now you look at the deals that are being made and what these games generate in terms of sales, and it's part of the media business. And still, even with that, how often do you hear about that type of marketing and advertising? It's still somewhat nascent in the grander scheme of what happens. So all of these interesting things that technology enables, just like, again, as a marketer, how can you sit here and be frustrated in a world where you have unlimited access to so many different channels, so many different tools? And if you don't even have the data in this world of AI and creating personas and synthetic data, it's kind of just a huge opportunity for anybody.
Yeah, it's a different world today though, because you were there when in my consulting days, for example, I had one of the largest QSRs, quick service restaurants in America, and I was trying to get them to, this is right after Facebook had launched brand pages, and I'm like, guys, we should at least just register your brand here and just get the name. And I showed them 5,000 people had already created groups about this company.
Yeah,
and their digital agency, and I wasn't at their digital agency, I was at their traditional PR firm. I was just a nerd. And their digital agency is like, no, Facebook isn't for them. And I'm like, I left that meeting and I told my boss, I'm registering the page. So I registered their official brand page, even though it wasn't even my remit. I built it to around 1 million members, and then I handed their marketing guy the keys. And I'm like, your digital agency is wrong. This is a very important asset. And eventually, the funny thing is, like a few years later, that agency built out like a social media practice. And it's so funny to me though, because at that point, it was everyone, there was such skepticism, right? And I think
skepticism, and there was also, in fairness, a lot of innocence. This idea that you can get 1 million followers and speak to them. I mean, 6 pixels separation, name of my blog and podcast, it's now Thinking with Mitch Joel. But the subtitle of the book of that was Everyone's Connected, Connect Your Business to Everyone. That was subtitle, not all that innovative, just what I called it. What's amazing in that innocent side of it is you did that work and you engaged with people. And it was really nice to have this ability to speak in a human way back and forth. Now, again, led to a lot of issues and troubles and public relations stuff for sure. But what's really interesting is how the platforms took control. The fact that you could accumulate 1 million people who would say, I'm raising my hand, I'm okay to be connected to you, QSR. And suddenly the platform was saying, well, if you want to access those people, we're going to make you pay for it. It's really interesting too to watch the level of sophistication and watching that innocence disappear as well. One of the things that I loved so much about digital media was that it was a kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom. All of these places, whether it was a small and meager Facebook, whether it was this new thing called Instagram, or whether it was YouTube and this massive acquisition that Google took over on, or just even my blog or your podcast. This idea that you could find the right audience and speak to them in a way that would be more accepted because they're consuming content in that way. And then you just look at how the power of the networks and platforms just totally took over. And we are essentially in a world where we were pre-internet, where it was 3 or 4 network channels and conglomerates, maybe even less of those now. Yeah, so it's also interesting to watch the sophistication of the output of the media side of the marketing business for sure.
Yeah, everything old is new again, because since all of our channels are at the whim of the social channels are at the whim of algorithms, like the most valuable channel for me in a lot of cases is simply email, because it's unmediated. Every email I send will go to that subscriber. And most people actually manage their inbox fairly well. I find email is like the most sane place on the internet for me. And it's funny because this is like a return to form of where we were when we started. And, perhaps some things are very cyclical. The tech that we work on powers out-of-home ads, and these are the only ads that aren't skippable. Your attention in the real world is of higher quality than online. Out-of-home ads are actually the only ad format that people take photos of and share with their social network every day. So I was excited to work on this because we're taking the very traditional and we're applying a tech layer to it and turning it into a proper part of your ad tech stack, which is cool. And also, I don't have to worry about the algorithms of big companies. There's no algorithm on Times Square or driving down a highway. So out of home has been really fun for me. Just like email, my personal blog on Substack, I have the most readers I've ever had, and it's all via email. And I find that practice, I mean, you haven't ever stopped blogging, but when I was at Google, I took a hiatus of blogging because I couldn't say a lot of things I want to say. But now that I'm back into the writing long form daily, I find it my favorite activity. I'm like so sad I ever gave it up and just posted to like LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. And it's a better, healthier activity, I think, for a person like us.
It's a funny thing too. I saw things similar and different. It's normal. Blogging comes out and everyone has a blog, or everyone's doing Twitter at the time with microblogging is what they called it. And it wasn't because we had all these writers that were being restrained. It's because that was the only way you could really communicate your idea to this mass platform that was distributed globally. Meaning once text was there, then we had images. And so people jumped to pictures, and then we had audio and obviously video after. Like the level of sophistication kept increasing. And so when people say that to me, in particular, Substack's a great example of this, or email newsletters are as well. I love it more than ever, because the people who are doing it are the actual writers, not because that's all there was, but it's because they like to do it. I literally just came from having a coffee with a business peer, and that was my recognition in them saying, I can't believe how long you've been writing and what you do. And I realized in the moment that I really like not just having the thought and writing it, I really do enjoy playing with words and how they're formulated, and even messing a little bit with grammar, which I tend to do, or punctuation and things like that. It's just something I like to do. So it's not that I look at this and go, I should write because Substack's popular. I'm writing because I'm a writer. It's similar to my podcast. Like, what is the thing that's going on there? It's similar to this. I like the ability to corner somebody who is definitely smarter than I am and spend time trying to understand the work that matters to them, because I do have a background in journalism, but it's less about the journalism and more about that peer-based communication. I feel like it's very much missing from the rhetoric we see today, which is like two people who know enough to be dangerous about the topic, either dissecting it, learning more from one another, or being provoked in certain angles. So again, those are the outputs that I just personally enjoy. And why do we create? We create because we want to put something into the world that we ourselves would want to consume. Like, don't write a book for an audience, write the book you want to read.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think about is how, we have cars now, but we still like to hike and jog. And I think for writing, I think people will maintain that even in an AI world, because it's basically like sending a robot to the gym for you. And that's not to say AI might not be really useful for research, but you wouldn't, just because you have a car doesn't mean you don't run. I mean, there's benefits of it being a human. And I just think that there's this sect of, super accelerationist people that think humans won't do anything creative again. I'm like, you guys are, super nerds, but you don't really get humanity. You're a 20-something kid. And, I think they'll get there eventually.
I had two thoughts. One is, I think it's hilarious that I had this image of getting a robot so that I could put my Whoop on it so I could optimize my stats. That'd be great. Perfect. I think it works great. But more, not jokingly, I would have assumed that if we do all this and they're right, that's all we have left is our creativity, is our ability to do the creative things. I mean, this is the Star Trek story. What does everyone do if they're not on the Enterprise racing through space, discovering strange new worlds? And the answer, from what I could tell on the B-roll, is someone's a sommelier, someone's a gardener, somebody's a teacher. Like, they are pursuing for interest, not because they have to sustain. And so I do like the grand vision of that as an endpoint. I don't know how realistic it is based off of how we are economically and how we think about capitalism in our lives. But there's something beautiful about that idea that if we could actually get to the point where the humans aren't doing it to sustain, humans are doing things to thrive. That's like a super interesting experiment. I worry very deeply about what happens between now and then. Like that's the part that is very, very murky and cloudy and scary.
Yeah, there's an interesting conversation around that too, where it's you and I can say, there's these creative things that we might enjoy, but what happens to the percent of the population that just isn't creative, that doesn't like to do that?
But creativity is different, right? Like to some people, like being an accountant is how they express that.
Well, that'll be a job AI fully takes.
No, but I'm just saying that, like, okay, but then maybe my job is, because I like the space, overseeing or being a part of how algorithms are created, or having some type of regulatory space between humans and machines. Like, who knows what we're going to create? My point being that when we say creative, some people immediately go to art. And I think there's many things we do that are very creative and interesting, or like I said, help you thrive. I mean, reading a book isn't necessarily a creative act, but if that's what gives you your thing, and self-education becomes your thing, how lovely would that be? Look, how many people do we know romanticize the idea that when I retire, I'll wake up in the morning, go for a nice brisk walk, go to a beautiful cafe, engage in some news and some local culture, and then head over to the library where I can sit in a nice comfy chair and read everything to it sounds so romantic, but the truth is, if suddenly the acquisition of knowledge becomes the thing, that's interesting. In a world where you're right, you don't have to. You could simply ask the search engine. I mean, you don't really have to do this, but those will become the things we'll think about. And I do think even things like, back to the topic, building a brand, having a vision. I mean, we have to remember that right now we don't have any foreshadowing technology that can look to the future and tell us the inevitability of it. Everything is historical based. This is the foundational criticism of why we have human in the loops and sayings like that ultimately all it's generating isn't something new, it's something based off of something old. Where I don't think people are understanding this is how culture moves forward. It's a very basic example. There's 7 notes that you can play on a guitar or any instrument. There are chords and variations, and there are endless ways you could make things connect. So that's like saying, well, if historically we have the Beatles that are the greatest band of all time, that means nothing can come after that. They've solved it. It's not true. But we can take influences from bands like that and create something new from that. And I think this is the hurdle that we, and including marketers, are currently facing. Like, yes, it is only looking at historical things, but typically that's what a creative does anyways. We are looking at historical things and trying to find something that would make it noticeably new, as we used to say in the agency business. That's the goal, is how do we make something to an audience that is noticeably new?
Yeah. I also think there's going to be a human premium, right? Like,
yes,
maybe in the future, maybe in the far off future, you'll want robots serving you at a restaurant. But if I'm going to a nice restaurant, I want a person to engage with and tell me about the specials and the wine and whatnot. So I think there'll be a premium on human labor, even if there are, like Elon talks about, robots are going to do everything and everyone can retire if they want. I still think humans will matter in ways that like the nerds don't necessarily think about.
Yeah, they will. The challenge to it is, with every good comes the other. So if you're correct, and I don't know if you are, we're gonna roll this out and see how the world goes. The other side of it can be quite scary, which is, for example, only people who have real wealth and access can have access to a therapist, because we have all these bots that are experts at this and can do it. And the answer is, yeah. I mean, I guess in a world where some people can't get any help, giving them some help is better than no help. But creating a divide, what we used to call a digital divide, I'm not sure how well that plays out for humanity in a world where, again, maybe nobody sees a doctor unless you have extreme affluence and access. Now, we might say, well, that's fair. That's capitalism. It's how the world works. I'm based a little bit further north than you. And again, the idea of socialized, I'm not saying socialism, but socialized healthcare, socialized education. There's something about it that does work too, where everybody has somewhat equal access to certain services that are foundational to our well-being. So, like, all these little nuances are going to become very interesting debates and conversations, as I would never bet against Elon. We could bet against timelines, but never the idea type of thing. And we'll see what happens when we unleash so much information, so much access, and a higher level of intelligence, to a certain degree of information, at least to everyone.
Totally. Well, Mitch, this has been really interesting talking to you. Tell us about your company and where people can go to connect with you.
Sure. Yeah. So my podcast and my writing is Thinking with Mitch Joel. You can just put that in. It's there. One of the startups that I'm running is called ThinkersOne, which is a place where companies can buy 15-minute live video and or recorded video experiences for their meetings. So it's a way to bring the thought leaders you typically see on the stages across the world or in your Substacks to your everyday meetings or just special events that you're doing within your organization. And that's at thinkersone.com. And I'm super accessible and always happy to connect. Just thanks.
Awesome. We'll put links to connect with Mitch in the show description. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again next week.